Good afternoon, folks. Got a few collection videos coming up in the next several days, week or so. I'll just tell you what I have in the queue for at least the next few. Ty Prawn, Zach G, Brian K. I think there's maybe one or two more, but I'm not sure. Anyways, I wanted to do a relatively brief video that's partially in response to Jeffrey McMahon's video earlier today, which was about, but it basically says why he'll never tell you he won't get a Rolex. And as I was replying to him in his comments fields, I was just thinking about if and when I buy a Tier 5 watch, what would come before I bought a Rolex? Because I've been quite vocal about saying that I'm not in love with Rolex. They're not one of my favorite brands. But I've also tried to balance that with recognition that they make great watches, and they do make watches that I really like. I just don't have that special love for them. So I'm not a hater, but I'm not a fanboy, if that makes sense. Anyways, but yeah, if I was asked the question, well, what would you, let me just back up and say, refresh you on what I mean by Tier 5. I've done a system of 7 tiers, and in a way, it really comes down to price ranges, but there are characteristics of the different tiers. Not all watches within those tiers follow those characteristics, but by and large, Tier 5 watches have certain things in common. First of all, Tier 5 watches start around $5,000 US and go up to around 15 grand. This tier represents true luxury, meaning it's not high-end luxury like Patek Philippe or Audemars Piguet or Breguet or Vacheron Constantin, but nor are they just the entry or low-end luxury like the Tier 3 and 4. And so yeah, Tier 5 is like when you've got a true luxury watch, but it's not like out of control high-end. So Rolex is the definitive Tier 5 brand. I mean, not only are they the definitive luxury watch brand, but they are the one that rule Tier 5, so to speak. And that's where most Rolexes are within Tier 5. They make their Tier 4 brand is Tudor. And I think you could call some of I think the Oyster Perpetual is more like upper end Tier 4. And they have some Tier 6 watches as well. But they're really mainly a Tier 5 brand. And they rule it, but you also have brands like, Breitling and Omega make Tier 5 watches. Omega makes Tier 4 watches as well. Breitling, it's kind of, I would say some of their older stuff could be considered Tier 4. And you also have brands like IWC, Panerai, JLC, Jaeger-LeCoultre, and many others. And the main difference between Tier 4 and 5, aside from the price, certainly the prestige of the name is huge, and that jumps it up to Tier 5. Like Rolex is Tier 5 partially because of their name. But it's also higher quality materials, and I would say usually, if not almost always, in-house movement. If you're buying a watch for 8-9 grand that doesn't have an in-house movement, it's probably a Tier 4 watch that's marketed as a Tier 5 watch, and that's overpriced, in other words. Usually the finishing, design, and just the physical quality and the style are similar to Tier 4. That's, you get the big jump up to Tier 3 to 4. Tier 4 and 5 watches are similar in terms of like the looking at the watch visually, just looking at it and holding it. But on the other hand, on the other side, the Tier 6 is we're not quite into solid gold watches, platinum, diamonds, and other jewels, and super complex movements, which are kind of the Tier 6 watches. So again, the main difference between 4 and 5 isn't the actual physical quality of the watch. You're getting almost all of that in the Tier 4, but you're getting this extra element of possibly, probably, in-house movements, maybe higher quality grade metals, and prestige. So Jeff wrote did an excellent video earlier today where he was basically saying that he's never going to say he's not going to get a Rolex because he feels like it would be dishonest or disingenuous, because if he had the money, it would be different, right? So for somebody who can't buy Tier 5 watches, you can't really say, oh, I'll never get a Rolex, because you don't know unless you had the money to buy Tier 5 watches. So I was thinking about if I had a significant amount of money, if I was multi-six-figure income, millions in the bank, that sort of thing, I would definitely own a Rolex or two or three, without a doubt, you know. But they wouldn't be the first Tier 5 watch that I would buy. And so I was just thinking about, well, what would I buy before a Rolex? What would I buy? Again, I'm not a hater or a lover. They're just not my very favorite brand. So I wrote down a few things here that I wanted to, you know, just put out there. So I think, you know, my favorite brands of watch are Omega and Breitling, and I've been very open and honest about that. I don't love all Omegas and certainly not all Breitlings, but as far as like the style cues, just the overall look and feel of watches, Omega and Breitling are my favorite. So if I got to Tier 5, meaning if I was like going to spend $5,000 or more, I'd probably look first at their offerings, and there are specific watches that I really, really love. So for instance, Omega, the Planet Ocean. The Planet Ocean, like the Submariner, is an entry level, it's like an entry into Tier 5 watch. The Planet Ocean, I think, retails for around $6,000 or so. I'm talking about the non-chronograph, but you can buy it on the gray market for about $4,000. But I'd still consider it a Tier 5 watch. It has that in-house 8500 movement or 9300 for the chronograph. It's just a step up from, you know, Omega's signature Tier 4 line is the Seamaster, so it's a step up from that. Also, I'd look at the chronograph, which is a larger, more expensive watch. The GMT I like, and the Dark Side of the Moon would definitely be a Tier 5 Omega I would get. So those would be all watches that I would consider. Certainly at least one Planet Ocean, Dark Side of the Moon, and maybe a GMT, I'm not sure. I like that blue one with the orange numerals. And Breitling, the first two that come to mind are a Navitimer. I would love to have a Navitimer. I've considered getting a Navitimer because you can sometimes find them used for less, for more like 3 to 4. But the problem there is they go back years and years and years, and so you're dabbling with vintage in some cases, and it's hard to find one that is the right size. I really like 44 millimeters max, and has been recently serviced, and it's kind of a complex mess. But the Navitimer, and I like their newer versions too, and the Blackbird black steel version, which I think is just a really gorgeous watch. Not the most recent one, but the one that's from 2007 to 11 or so. And then the non-black steel version as well, but you can get that for more like 3,000. So I consider that more of a Tier 4 watch. So that's Omega and Breitling. Those are the ones that I would go for right away if I was in that zone, or if I all of a sudden had a lot of money, if I wrote the next Game of Thrones. But other brands and watches that I consider, once we get past Omega and Breitling, you know, and there's several models there, then I start considering Rolex in with the other brands in terms of my taste. Other brands and watches that I would consider, IWC Portuguese. I never really looked into IWC until I went to New York a few months ago, and yeah, I was very struck by how the quality of the IWC watches, and I really like the Portuguese for like a dressy sport watch. And you know, Panerai is another brand. I'm not in love with Panerai, but I certainly really like the submersible line. I don't like their more Luminor. I'm not as into those, but the submersible is really cool, I think. And let me just turn this down. Sounds from the Ground again, folks. Albums Tribes. And other than that, as far as like new watches, that's about where I'd stop. There's also, once you, in the tier 5, you could consider used tier 6 watches in that range. So possibly my favorite tier 6 brand is Breguet. I think Breguet, when I was in New York, that was the brand that I was so struck by the quality of their watches. They just shone with like, this is a luxury timepiece. I didn't get that same feeling from Patek, to be honest. Now that might just be personal style, but the Breguet really shone for me. So yeah, some kind of Breguet, you know, you can get some really nice Breguets in that 5 to 15 range. Roger Dubuis makes some nice watches. The Excalibur is a really cool watch. There's some very interesting versions, but again, that's really a tier 6 watch, so it's hard to find. You can find that used. And then as far as once we get to Rolex, you know, I guess like if I was to get a Rolex, I'd be looking at the ceramic sub. So that's the more recent sub, which starts around $6,000, and that's even used. I think new it's like 8. I would look at the GMT. I like the bezel on the GMT better, and I think it's less anymore. I think you can get good GMTs for like $5,000, and perhaps a Daytona. And Daytona's really they're almost like, I see tier 5 as being on one end you have the Rolex Submariner, on the other end you have the Daytona, which is much more like a $12,000 watch. But you can get them used for under 10. So yeah, I mean, again, in summary, I would definitely get a Rolex at some point, and maybe several if I had the money. But they wouldn't be, you know, I would certainly be getting the Omegas and the Breitlings of that range first. And I'd be looking at IWC Portuguese, I'd be looking at used Roger Dubuis and used Breguet, and maybe a Panerai. And with that, in that second tier, I guess you could say, not tier in my tier system, but in that second grouping of watches in terms of how desirable they are in that tier 6 range, Rolex would be in that second grouping. So yeah, we'll see. Who knows? Maybe someday I will feel comfortable in that range. Maybe I'll have the money for that. And maybe Johnny Casual circa 2025 will be wearing a Rolex. Who knows? But again, you know, and this is the thing with watch tastes, it changes over time. You know, I feel like it changes less and less. Again, I've used the analogy of Zeno's arrow, where you take, like, let's say the arrow's shot here, here's the target, you have the distance, go like that, you never get to the target, it gets finer and finer. And I feel like all developmental changes are like that. That the biggest, it's like if you learn to play the violin the first year, you make the biggest progress. The second year you make less progress, but still substantial. And then it keeps on going down, making less totally bungled that word. Less progress, but you're still developing, and it's finer and finer, okay? And I feel like taste is like that too. My tastes are still changing, but it's slower now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah, who knows? I might. So I guess what I'm saying is that I have a sense of where I'll be in 5-10 years in terms of my taste, but I don't think it'll be that. It'll be different perhaps from now. Maybe it'll have refined more in different ways, and shifted, and I'll explore different territories. But it's the basics are already here. I'm already a quote unquote adult. You know what I mean? I already have my basic template for what I like and what I don't like. And then it will just be exploring that and probably getting more and more. But I you know, on a different note, I just had a very difficult last couple of days with regards to watches, because I was on the verge of buying a Breitling Blackbird, a used Breitling Blackbird, not the black steel, the stainless steel version, which I just absolutely love. But I can't afford it right now. I was like on the verge. The guy was just about to send me an invoice. And I just said, listen, I'm sorry. I just can't do this right now. And I felt bad because we'd kind of gone through all this miscommunication, and we just kind of worked our way through it. And then I pulled back at the last minute, which is kind of a hassle for both of us, but certainly annoying for him. But I think it was the right thing to do. I think I'm still looking at a couple of things. I'm trying to make a trade, to be honest, right now, which if I go further with that, I'll let you know. But I don't want to go in the red right now with watch purchases. Anything I buy, I really want it to come out of actual money I have. So that means I have to sell watches if I want to buy anything. And I'd really like to get that Breitling, but I just had to hold off. Self-restraint. How do you like it, folks? I showed self-restraint. All right, talk to you later. I wanted to do a relatively brief video that's partially in response to Jeffrey McMahon's video earlier today, which was about, it basically says why he'll never tell you he won't get a Rolex. And as I was replying to him in his comments fields, I was just thinking about if and when I buy a Tier 5 watch, what would come before I bought a Rolex? Because I've been quite vocal about saying that I'm not in love with Rolex. They're not one of my favorite brands. But I've also tried to balance that with recognition that they make great watches, and they do make watches that I really like. I just don't have that special love for them. So I'm not a hater, but I'm not a fanboy, if that makes sense. Anyways, but yeah, if I was asked the question, well, what would you, let me just back up and say, refresh you on what I mean by Tier 5. I've done a system of 7 tiers, and in a way, it really comes down to price ranges, but there are characteristics of the different tiers. Not all. Good afternoon, folks. Got a few collection videos coming up in the next several days, week or so. I'll just tell you what I have in the queue for at least the next few. Ty Prawn, Zach G, Brian K. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 more, but I'm not sure. Anyways, watches within those tiers follow those characteristics, but by and large, Tier 5 watches have certain things in common. First of all, Tier 5 watches start around $5,000 US and go up to around 15 grand. This tier represents true luxury, meaning it's not high-end luxury like Patek Philippe or